So 4 or 5 months ago, I did a bunch of videos going over a ton of leaks for the first Diablo 4 expansion, stuff like a raid, the zones it was going to be in, a bunch of new systems, a new class, and then fast forward to BlizzCon, some of that information was confirmed, and as we got more and more information about the expansion, about Season 3, and about these leaks, it seemed like a lot or all of this information was legitimate. And a little bit after I did all of those videos, there was actually some additional information that came out that included a massive file of strings that showed a ton of additional information that a lot of these initial leaks really didn't go over. So specifically in this video, I want to go over some of that leaked information and the new information from these strings, specifically based around the raid that seems to be coming with the first Diablo 4 expansion. But also make sure to subscribe because there's a ton more videos I want to do going over all of the other information that can be gleaned from these leaked files. Now, first off, if you didn't see those initial leaks I went over, one of the big parts about the expansion leaks is that there's going to be a new system called raids added into Diablo 4, and the first raid is going to be with the first expansion. This first raid would be called 5 Hills, which is a Tomb of Akarat, and it's a raid that has 5 different wings. So it's going to be pretty substantial. It seems like it's going to have quite a lot of bosses, and there's going to be quite a lot of content within this raid. And this was actually one of the pieces of information that was pretty consistent through all of the different leaks I saw. And then once these leaked files were released, we actually got a ton of additional information. And keep in mind that these leaked strings are basically just code used in encrypted builds for Blizzard to use for internal testing for the expansion. So even though we can glean a bunch of interesting information from these, this stuff isn't final, and it doesn't mean all of this stuff is going to be in the expansion. Now, the leaks mention this being a 5-wing raid, and when looking in this file, this seems to be pretty well supported because there is a massive list of code going over all of the different directions in the raid, which seems to be how they're coding all the different wings, north, south, east, west, etc. It sounds very reminiscent of the Naxxramas raid from World of Warcraft, where you start at the middle and every direction is a new wing. But this massive long list of files is a lot of the groundwork they need to do to actually create the environments and assets for the raid. So files for the terrain, for lighting, for audio, for props, VFX, boss rooms, and even things like camera design. And like mentioned, there are just dozens and dozens of lines going over all of this information, specifically being labeled as a Khazra raid. Now, past all of that base information that I think just heavily reinforces that the raid is obviously real and it's going to be a big part of the expansion, there's actually a lot of different boss mechanics we can kind of glean from these strings, and some seem quite interesting. In fact, when I was looking over all these different strings that pertain to the raid, one of the things that kept coming up over and over again was a lot of different mechanics that we haven't seen in Diablo 4 and even in other Diablo games. Just a lot of things that seem pretty reminiscent of World of Warcraft raids or even reminiscent of Destiny 2 raids. One thing specific is a receptacle. One thing specific being that receptacles are mentioned quite a bit, and things like soul orbs or items you can pick up seemingly and carry around. So it sounds like these are some of the mechanics for some of the bosses within the raid, to where there might be a lot more interactable objects within the boss fights, giving these raid bosses a lot more mechanics and a lot different mechanics that you usually don't see in Diablo games or other ARPGs. Another interesting one was something labeled minus pressure and plus pressure, which is specifically labeled for a boss, and it's also labeled within these soul orb items. So the first thing I thought of was maybe a boss has this like pressure mechanic that you have to try to balance out in the fight to maybe do full damage, or maybe they're immune if their pressure isn't calculated, where you have to maybe take these different orbs and put them in different receptacles to like balance out a boss. And that's just complete speculation on my part, but a lot of these different strings do point to there being a lot more interesting mechanics within these raid bosses that we don't see in other bosses. And that's definitely something I would personally want with a raid in Diablo 4. I don't want it being basically just another boss that you dodge a few things and you just basically DPS it down, which is usually what most other ARPG bosses end up being. You usually just dodge your abilities, kill them, and maybe kill some ads to do some specific things. There's usually not super intricate boss fights in ARPGs or in Diablo, but if you go to something like, say, World of Warcraft, you have a lot more interesting intricate mechanics with a lot of other things you actually have to do within raid boss fights, and that's something I very much want within the raid. I know that in ARPGs, a lot of people just want to go as fast as they can, kill as many things as fast as possible, but I do think a raid is a perfect opportunity to kind of slow down that out of combat gameplay and have much more substantial bosses with a lot more mechanics to deal with that gives you a much greater sense of accomplishment once you actually beat that boss. It does also seem like there's going to be raid-specific item drops. There's specific mention of like boss maces, boss scepters, and a few other mention of items. Now, we obviously have no idea how loot is actually going to work. We don't know if you have to go do the raid to get the specific items from the raid. I would hope that bosses within the raid would have their own items that at least have a much higher chance to specifically drop from them. I know a lot of other ARPGs have items that specifically drop from that boss that you can't get anywhere else. That's something I would hope for, and it does seem that there's at least going to be items created directly for the raid, even if you may be able to get them outside of the raid. Now, a very interesting part is that there are difficulty selectors mentioned multiple times within these strings, so it sounds like there are going to be multiple difficulties of the raid that you'll be able to select between. This definitely sounds something more like from World of Warcraft, where you have the 4 different difficulties you can basically select between, and without knowing how exactly they're going to go about doing this, it doesn't really tell us if this is going to be like a good system or if this is going to be something inspired from MMOs. But there is also mention of raid tiers, specifically labeled as raid tier 0, raid tier 1, all the way up to raid tier 5. So this could also be talking about the different difficulties of the raid. There could be 5 different raid tiers. It would make sense as an ARPG to have more and more difficulty as you keep going. And I think there may be some additional information that may give us a little bit of a glimpse of how this may work, because there's also some mentions of a hub within the raid. So maybe there is some like crafting hub within the raid itself. There's also a mention of raid crafter consumables. So it seems like there's going to be specific consumables for the raid, or maybe even a new raid crafter that allows you to craft these consumables for the raid. And then there's also something mentioned as corrupted sigils within the files. Now, these are mentioned with a bunch of the other crafting vendors, so these could just be talking about like sigils for nightmare dungeons, but this could also point to there being a similar sigil system for raids as to how we have for, say, nightmare dungeons, or how we had for the abattoir of Zir. And these different tiers of the raid could be pointed to that as well. There's different tiers, and you craft those different corrupted sigils with resources you get specifically from the raid. Different raid specific resources were actually mentioned as well, so you could potentially go through the raid, kill some bosses, get a new specific resource, and maybe you have to defeat a certain amount of the bosses, or maybe you have to defeat the end boss, and then you can craft a corrupted sigil for the raid, and you'd be able to go up to the next tier. That could actually be a decent bit of progression through that, especially if this is a really big raid, which it sounds like it is, and these bosses are really difficult. That could actually end up being a very interesting system that gives you a lot of progression. And if this ends up being the case where it's a massive raid where you have to get new resources to get these corrupted sigils to go up to the higher tier and continue to do that, that would also give people a very big incentive to actually make boss killing builds, which still isn't a thing in Diablo 4. Diablo 4 still doesn't have enough bosses to where creating a boss killing build would actually be something players want to do. Players will change up their build a bit if they're going to do Uber Lilith, or maybe they're farming a ton of Duriels, but generally people aren't just fully creating builds with full sets of gear, full Paragon boards, and skill loadouts specifically to beat bosses. So I hope this is something that the raid actually accomplishes. Now, this is a lot of the stuff I found most interesting within these files, but this is by no means all of the information pertaining to the raid. There's a bunch of other information specifically around like the different directions and different bosses in those directions, more boss mechanics, different things like holdout tunnels being mentioned. So it sounds like there's different events or enemies you have to fight through between the bosses. So even when comparing it to something like a World of Warcraft raid, you have a bunch of trash mobs before you get to the boss. Seems like there's going to be something like that. There's even raid events mentioned. There's some type of different raid buffs or party buffs also mentioned. So there is a bunch of other information you could find in these files that seem pretty interesting. And I think the big conclusion when looking over all of this information is that raids are absolutely coming to Diablo 4. It's just how they're going to be implemented and how cool the bosses are going to be, which are going to be the big deciding factors. But that's pretty much all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.